Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she explores the enduring city of Gdańsk, in Poland. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The morning air in Gdansk carried a freshness that surprised Lyla. Even in July, the Baltic Sea kept the temperature comfortable, and as she walked through the streets of the old town, she felt energized and curious. The city had a weight to it, a sense of history layered upon history, and she was eager to discover it slowly, on foot, at her own pace. She began at the Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance to the Long Market. The gate was ornate and imposing, built of cream-colored stone, with sculptures adorning its top figures, representing virtues like peace, freedom, wealth, and fame. The gate had been rebuilt after the devastation of World War II, and knowing this added poignancy to its beauty. This city had been destroyed and had chosen to rebuild to remember, to honor what had been lost. Lyla passed through the gate and found herself on Mariacka Street, the beginning of the Royal Way. The buildings here were tall and narrow, their facades painted in soft colors, pale yellows, muted greens, terracotta reds. Many had ornate detailing at their rooflines, decorative gables, statues, intricate stonework. Each building seemed to have its own personality, its own story. The street was busy but not overwhelming, with tourists and locals moving in both directions, shops displaying amber jewelry in their windows, cafes with outdoor seating beginning to fill with morning customers. The cobblestones beneath her feet were worn smooth, and Lyla imagined the centuries of footsteps that had passed this way. Merchants and nobles, soldiers and citizens, all walking this same route through the heart of the city. She paused at Ophagen House, a restored townhouse that had been turned into a museum. The building's facade was elegant, with tall windows and decorative details. She stepped inside, paying the small entrance fee, and found herself transported back to the 18th century. The interior rooms were furnished as they would have been when a wealthy merchant family lived here. Rich fabrics, polished wood, portraits on the walls, china displayed in cabinets. Each room was carefully preserved, showing the domestic life of Gdansk's prosperous residents. Lyla moved slowly through the spaces, admiring the craftsmanship of the furniture, the beauty of the decorative tiles around the fireplaces, the way light fell through the old glass windows. In one room, a guide was speaking to a small group in Polish. Though Lyla couldn't understand the words, she appreciated the reverence in the guide's tone, the way he gestured to details, encouraging his group to look closely, to notice the small things. An older couple was examining a painted ceiling, and when they noticed Lyla looking up as well, the woman smiled. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she said in accented English, "that all of this survived, or was so carefully restored. After the war, so much was lost, but they brought it back." "Are you from Gdansk?" Lyla asked. "Warsaw," the woman said. "But my grandmother was from here. She used to tell me stories about the city before the war. She would be happy to see it now, I think." Beautiful again. They stood together for a moment, looking at the painted ceiling with its pastoral scenes and cherubs. And Lyla felt the presence of all those who had loved this city, who had worked to preserve or restore it, who had refused to let its beauty be permanently erased. She thanked the woman and continued her tour of the house, eventually emerging back onto Długa Street. The morning sun was higher now, warming the cobblestones, and she continued toward the heart of the old town. Neptune's fountain appeared at the center of the long market, the bronze figure of the sea god presiding over the square. The fountain was surrounded by the magnificent facades of the Artus Court and other historic buildings, their elaborately decorated fronts, creating one of the most photographed views in Poland. Tourists gathered around the fountain taking pictures, while locals crossed the square on their way to work or errands, barely glancing at what had become everyday scenery to them. Lyla sat on the edge of a planter near the fountain, taking in the scene. The Artus Court building was particularly striking, its facade covered in sculptural details, the interior visible through large windows. For centuries, this had been a meeting place for merchants and the wealthy elite, a center of commerce and social life. Now it was a museum, but the grandeur remained. A street musician had set up nearby, playing accordion, the melancholy melodies adding to the atmosphere. People dropped coins into his open case as they passed, and he nodded his thanks without pausing his playing. Lyla stood and walked toward St. Mary's Church, which rose up at the end of the street, its brick facade massive and imposing. The church was enormous, one of the largest brick churches in the world, she'd read. As she approached, she had to tilt her head back to see the top of the tower, which seemed to reach impossibly high into the pale blue sky. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the air carrying that particular smell of old stone and candle wax, and centuries of prayer. The interior space was vast, the vaulted ceiling soaring overhead, supported by rows of white columns. Light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colors across the stone floor. Lyla walked slowly down the nave, her footsteps echoing softly. The church was mostly empty. A few people sat in pews, praying or simply resting, and a small group followed a guide speaking in hushed tones. The scale of the place was overwhelming, designed to make humans feel small, to inspire awe. She noticed a narrow doorway leading to stairs and realized this must be the way up to the tower. On impulse, she decided to climb. The stairs were steep and seemed endless, spiraling up through the brick tower. She took her time, pausing on the landings to catch her breath, noting the way the light changed as she climbed higher. Finally, she emerged onto the viewing platform. The view was spectacular. The entire old town spread out below, a pattern of red roofs and narrow streets, the Motława River winding through the city, the harbor visible in the distance with cranes and ships. She could see how the city was laid out, the careful planning of its streets, the way it had grown along the river. The wind was stronger up here, whipping her hair around her face, and the bells in the tower above her were massive, silent now but imposing in their presence. Lyla stood at the railing, taking in the panorama, feeling the history beneath her. This church that had stood for centuries, that had witnessed wars and peace, destruction and rebuilding, that had remained a constant as everything around it changed. Another visitor emerged onto the platform. A young man with a camera. They exchanged smiles, that universal acknowledgement between travelers. "First time in Gdańsk?" he asked. "It is," Lyla said. "You?" "Third time. I keep coming back. There's something about this city. It gets under your skin. The history, the resilience. Every time I visit, I find something new to appreciate." "I can understand that," Lyla said. "Even just this morning, I feel that weight of history. But it's not heavy, it's meaningful." "Exactly," he said. "That's exactly it." They stood together for a few more minutes, taking photos, pointing out landmarks to each other, and then he headed back down the stairs, and Lyla was alone again with the view and the wind and the silent bells. Eventually, she descended as well, her legs slightly shaky from all the stairs. Back at ground level, the church felt even more impressive, knowing she'd been at the very top of that tower. She left the church and found her way to Mariacka Street, one of the most picturesque lanes in the city. The street was narrow and cobbled, lined with tall, slender buildings, each one with its own distinctive entrance, approached by a few steps. These were the famous stoops where amber merchants had once displayed their wares. Now the ground floors housed amber shops and galleries, and small cafes. Lyla walked slowly down the street, admiring the details, the old-fashioned lanterns hanging from buildings, the amber displayed in shop windows glowing like trapped sunlight, the gargoyle downspouts on the buildings, the window boxes overflowing with flowers. She stopped at one shop where an artisan sat at a workbench visible through the window, carefully shaping a piece of amber. The craftsmanship was mesmerizing. The patience required to work with such a delicate material, the skill to bring out its natural beauty. Lyla watched for a few minutes, and the artisan looked up and smiled, gesturing for her to come inside if she wanted a closer look. Inside, the shop was filled with amber jewelry necklaces, bracelets, earrings in every shade from pale yellow to deep cognac. The owner, an older woman with warm eyes and skilled hands, explained the different types of amber, how to tell genuine Baltic amber from imitations, the ancient history of the trade. "Amber is our gold here," she said. "For thousands of years, people have valued it. The ancient Romans called the Baltic the Amber Coast. It washes up on our beaches after storms, a gift from the sea." Lyla selected a small pendant, a simple piece of honey-colored amber on a silver chain. As the woman wrapped it carefully, they talked about the city, about Lyla's impressions, about the woman's family, who had been amber merchants for generations. "You should walk along the river," the woman said as Lyla prepared to leave. "The Motuava is beautiful, especially near the old crane." "That's the heart of historic Gdansk," where the ships came, where the trade happened, very peaceful now. Lyla thanked her and continued toward the river. The streets grew quieter as she left the main tourist area, and soon she could hear water and smell that particular river and harbor scent, wet wood and algae and salt. The Motłava River walk opened up before her, a wide promenade running along the water's edge. To her left, the river flowed slowly, reflecting the sky and the buildings on its opposite bank. To her right, a row of beautiful old buildings faced the water, former granaries and merchant houses, their facades painted in shades of gold and cream and rust, each one with a distinctive gable. The walk was popular with both tourists and locals. People strolled along, sat on benches facing the water, or dined at the outdoor restaurants that had set up tables along the promenade. The atmosphere was relaxed, unhurried. Lyla walked north along the river, and soon the massive wooden crane came into view. It was one of Gdańsk's most iconic sights, a medieval harbor crane with its distinctive twin towers and wooden mechanism, once used to load and unload cargo from ships, to lift masts into place. Now it was part of the Maritime Museum, but it remained where it had always stood, a reminder of the city's maritime heritage. She stood beneath it, looking up at the wooden beams and wheels, imagining it in operation centuries ago, the shouting of workers, the creaking of wood under weight, the bustle of a busy Portugalski. Information plaques explained its history and function, how it had been the largest crane in medieval Europe, a symbol of Gdansk's wealth and importance as a trading center. A river cruise boat passed by, its guide speaking through a microphone, pointing out the crane to passengers. The boat's wake created gentle waves that lapped against the embankment, and gulls swooped down to investigate, hoping for food. Lyla continued walking north, leaving the most touristy section of the riverfront behind. The buildings here were more utilitarian, the atmosphere quieter. She could see the shipyard in the distance, the cranes and facilities of the modern port, still active, still connected to the city's maritime routes. She came to the European Solidarity Center, a modern building of rust-colored steel that contrasted sharply with the historic architecture she'd been immersed in all morning. The building was striking, angular and contemporary, and as she approached, she saw that its walls were covered in words and images related to the Solidarity movement. Inside, the museum was powerful and moving. Exhibits told the story of the Solidarity trade union movement that had begun in Gdańsk's shipyards in 1980, led by Lech Wałęsa and other workers demanding their rights. The movement had eventually contributed to the fall of communism across Eastern Europe, and Gdańsk had been at the center of it all. Lyla moved through the exhibit slowly, reading about the strikes, the negotiations, the martial law that had been imposed, the eventual triumph. There were photographs of workers, recordings of speeches, recreations of the shipyard gates, where it had all begun. The story was one of ordinary peoples standing up against an oppressive system, risking everything for freedom and dignity. One section of the museum featured personal testimonies, video recordings of people who had been part of the movement, their faces lined with age now, their voices matter-of-fact as they described extraordinary courage. Lyla found herself deeply moved, standing in a darkened room, watching these testimonies, feeling the weight of what had happened here, what had been sacrificed and won. When she emerged back into the daylight, she felt slightly disoriented, as if she'd traveled through time and needed a moment to return to the present. The shipyard area stretched out around her, the actual historic shipyard where Solidarity had been born, now partially preserved as a monument, partially still functioning as an active Portugalski. She walked through the area, seeing the famous Quai Nodois, where workers had gathered during the strikes, where flowers were still laid in memory. The monument to the fallen shipyard workers rose nearby. 3 massive crosses made of steel, reaching toward the sky, anchors at their base. The monument was simple but powerful, a stark reminder of those who had died in the struggle for freedom. The area was quiet now, almost contemplative. A few other visitors walked through, but there was no sense of rush, no tour groups hurrying from site to site. This was a place for reflection, for considering history and its costs. Lyla stood before the monument for a long time, thinking about courage and sacrifice, about how change happens, about the importance of remembering. The steel crosses caught the afternoon light, casting long shadows across the ground. Eventually, she began walking back toward the city center, but she chose a different route this time, following quieter streets away from the main tourist areas. These streets had their own beauty. More modest buildings, neighborhood shops, residents, going about their daily lives. She passed a small grocery store, where an elderly woman was selecting vegetables, a pharmacy with old-fashioned lettering on its window, a bakery, where the scent of fresh bread made her stomach growl despite not feeling particularly hungry. She came across a small park tucked between buildings, with a few benches and some flower beds, and a small playground where children were playing under the watchful eyes of their parents. Lyla sat on a bench for a while, watching the children, listening to their laughter, appreciating this small oasis of ordinary life. From there she wandered further, discovering small canals that branched off from the main river, narrow waterways lined with old buildings, bridges arching over them, ducks paddling along their surface. These canals gave the city a different character, more intimate and secret, like hidden pathways through history. She crossed a small footbridge and found herself on a quiet street lined with trees. The buildings here were residential, with flower boxes in windows and bicycles leaned against walls. An older man was tending a small garden plot, and he looked up and nodded as she passed. A cat sat in a sunny window watching the world with half-closed eyes. The afternoon was sliding toward evening now, the light taking on that golden quality that photographers love. Lyla made her way back toward the Motwava River, approaching it from a different angle this time, emerging near the riverfront south of where she'd been earlier. She found a bench facing west, where she would be able to watch the sunset over the water. A few other people had the same idea, a couple sharing ice cream, a solo traveler with a sketchbook, an elderly woman with a small dog. They were spaced far enough apart to maintain privacy, close enough to share the experience. Lyla sat down and simply breathed, letting the day settle into her. Her feet were pleasantly tired from all the walking, and she felt that particular kind of satisfaction that comes from a day spent exploring, learning, seeing with fresh eyes. The river moved past, slow and steady, its surface reflecting the changing light. Boats were moored along the opposite bank, their masts creating a forest of vertical lines against the sky. The old granaries glowed in the evening light, their colors deepening gold, becoming amber, cream becoming honey. She thought about everything she'd seen, the Golden Gate with its symbolic virtues, the merchant house preserved so carefully, the magnificent church reaching toward heaven, the charming Amber Street, the medieval crane that had once moved the trade goods that made this city wealthy. And then the newer history, the Solidarity movement, the shipyard workers who had stood up for their rights, the monument to those who had died, the museum that told their story with such care and respect. Gdansk was a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt, that had lived under occupation and fought for freedom, that had suffered and survived and chosen to remember rather than forget. There was something profound about walking through a city with such a complex history, feeling the layers of time, understanding that the beautiful facades she admired had been reconstructed stone by stone, that the freedom to walk these streets and admire them had been hard-won. The sun was lower now, touching the horizon, beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The water reflected the colors, doubling them, creating a pathway of light across the river's surface. The couple finished their ice cream and left. The solo traveler closed their sketchbook and wandered off, but the elderly woman with the dog remained, and Lyla was glad for the quiet company. A few ducks paddled past, making their way to wherever ducks go for the evening. A boat moved slowly upriver, its engine a low hum, leaving a V-shaped wake that spread across the water. The bells from St. Mary's Church began to ring, marking the hour, the sound carrying clearly across the rooftops. Lyla reached into her pocket and touched the amber pendant she'd bought, feeling its smooth surface, its warmth. The woman in the shop had said amber was a gift from the sea, and sitting here by the river at sunset, Lyla felt she understood. This whole day had been a kind of gift. The gift of a city opening itself to her, sharing its stories, its beauty, its sorrows and triumphs. The sky deepened to rose and purple, the clouds catching fire with reflected sunlight. The buildings along the river became silhouettes, their details fading but their distinctive outlines remaining clear. Lights began to come on, in windows, in street lamps, along the promenade, creating a different kind of beauty, warm and inviting, marking the transition from day to night. The elderly woman with the dog stood to leave, and as she passed Lila's bench she paused.
Piękny wieczór,
she said softly, gesturing at the sunset. Lyla didn't speak Polish, but she understood the sentiment. Yes, she said, beautiful evening. The woman smiled and continued on her way, the small dog trotting beside her, and Lyla was alone with the river and the sunset. and the quiet settling of the city into night. She thought about the young man she'd met at the top of St. Mary's Tower, who had said Gdansk gets under your skin. She understood now what he meant. This wasn't a city that presented itself superficially. You had to walk through it, climb its towers, visit its museums, listen to its stories. And when you did, it offered something real, something substantial, a connection to history, to human courage and creativity, to resilience and hope. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the sky continued to glow for a while, that afterglow that happens between day and night, when the world seems suspended between two states. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then more numerous, as the darkness deepened. The river reflected it all, the fading light, the emerging stars, the warm glow of the city lights. The water moved constantly but without hurry, carrying its history and its present moment together, inseparable. Lyla sat until full darkness had arrived, until the stars were clear and bright above, until the city had fully transitioned into its nighttime self. The promenade was quieter now, just occasional walkers, the restaurants, outdoor seating still busy with diners enjoying the warm July evening. She finally stood, her legs slightly stiff from sitting, and began walking slowly back toward her hotel. The streets were beautiful at night, the old buildings lit carefully to show off their architectural details, the cobblestones glowing under street lamps. She passed Neptune's fountain again, now illuminated dramatically, the bronze figure seeming almost alive in the play of light and shadow. The long market was quieter at this hour but still beautiful, the historic facades creating a kind of stage set, romantic and timeless. As she walked, Lyla felt a deep sense of gratitude for this day, for this city, for the chance to walk through history, to learn and reflect, to connect with something larger than herself. Gdansk had given her more than beautiful sights, it had given her perspective, had reminded her of the importance of resilience, of rebuilding, of remembering. The amber pendant rested against her collarbone, warm from her skin, a small piece of this place that she would carry with her. But more than that, she carried the memory of the day, the view from the church tower, the quiet of the canals, the power of the Solidarity Museum, the sunset over the Motłava. The evening air was cool now, pleasant after the warmth of the day. She could hear music from somewhere, accordion again, those melancholy Polish melodies that seemed to capture something essential about the place. The sound drifted through the streets, accompanying her walk, a soundtrack to her thoughts. She reached her hotel, a restored building in the old town, and paused at the entrance to look back at the street one more time. The city was settling into night, peaceful and beautiful, its history held carefully, its present moment gentle and welcoming. Tomorrow she would explore more, discover other layers, other stories. But tonight she carried the gift of this day, the knowledge of a city that had refused to surrender to destruction, that had chosen to rebuild and remember, that honored both its triumphs and its struggles with equal care. And she carried the memory of sitting by the Motłava at sunset, watching the light change over the water, feeling connected to something ancient and enduring. The river, the sea, the amber that washed up on beaches, the human desire to build and create and preserve, the stubborn hope that persists even through the darkest times.